What is up, you guys? Shan's here, and I'm so excited to bring you another episode of the Completely Living podcast, where we talk faith, Bible, and go wherever the Holy Spirit leads us. And today we're going to be going through Genesis chapter 10. So if you have not seen the videos or the podcasts on Genesis 1 through 9, make sure you go back and watch those. It's very important. We just ended chapter 9 with Ham doing something shameful to his father Noah and ends up getting his son Canaan cursed. And we have no real explanation in the text of why that happens. It was just all very interesting. And now we're going to be getting into 10, which talks more about the descendants of each of those sons of Noah after the great flood. So make sure you grab your Bible, follow along. We're going to be reading in the NLT version or the New Living Translation, but you can feel free to read whatever version is going to be best for you. But I will put the words on the screen if you are watching on the video and you're able to follow along. Now, I also must give a disclaimer that in this chapter, there are a lot of names for people and children and places and all of the things, and they are very hard for me to pronounce. I don't speak Hebrew, so this is going to be a challenge for me, but please bear with me. I am probably going to make several mistakes, but I'm just doing the best that I can, so please give me some grace as we get through these names to the best of my ability. All right, so let's start out with chapter 10, and it starts out with verse 1 saying, "This is the account of the families of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the three sons of Noah. Many children were born to them after the great flood." Verse 2. The descendants of Japheth were Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshach, and Tiras. The descendants of Gomer were Ashkenaz, Rippeth, and Togarmah. I wonder if I see the name Ashkenaz reminds me of there are a group of people called Ashkenazi Jews, like Jewish people. I wonder if they are descendants from this particular person, and that's where they get their name. Verse 4, the descendants of Jovan were Elisha, Tarshish, Kittim, Roddanam. Oh, and Roddanam. Hold on. So Japheth had other sons, but we just totally skipped them, and we only go through the descendants of Gomer and Javan, which I find interesting because obviously these others, does that mean they didn't have children? Or are we just not focused on those lines in particular? I don't know. I have questions. Okay, verse 5. Their descendants became the seafaring peoples that spread out to various lands, each identified by its own language, clan, and national identity. When I read the word seafaring people, it makes me feel like are they Vikings? This feels very like Game of Thronesy, and they were like that clan of people who like sailed everywhere. I don't know. Very interesting. And also, okay, when they spread out to various lands, did they spread out to various lands before God spread people out because of the Tower of Babel? Like, did they spread out pre that, and so they created their own language just because they sailed away and they had their own dialect, or were they broken up specifically because of the Tower of Babel, and then they just happened to sail away and create their own language? I just wonder if they if they did this sailing before or after Babel. Interesting. Descendants of Ham. Verse 6. The descendants of Ham were Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan. So that is Canaan, the same Canaan who was cursed after Ham did the bad thing to his father. And which also makes me question, if these are in order of the oldest to the youngest, does that mean Canaan is the youngest son? And if so, why was Canaan specifically cursed? Does that mean our theory that we talked about back in Genesis 9 is correct? And if you don't know what I'm talking about, you have to go back and watch it to figure out what the theory is on Canaan. But does that mean that the theory is correct? And that's why Canaan, as the youngest, even though he was the youngest son, he's cursed because there's a specific reason to curse Canaan? Interesting. And something else that I thought interesting is, I know that this curse on Canaan, where Noah curses Canaan and says like his descendants are going to be basically slaves to other people. And I know that especially in America, that was used to justify slavery for other groups of people, for Black people in particular in America. First of all, I want to point out the fact that it wasn't God who cursed Canaan? It was Noah who cursed Canaan. So I've heard this like argument that, oh, the descendants of Canaan are the slaves and all this stuff. But like, so you guys are just letting Noah make that decision? And I don't understand. Like, just because Noah said it doesn't mean that God necessarily condoned it. Just because it's in the Bible doesn't mean that God was happy about something. Like, Adam and Eve sinning is in the Bible because it's historical fact, but it is not something that God wanted to happen. He wanted to have relationship with us, and we chose to do the bad thing. So when you have things like slavery or cursing people and things like that, and it's not coming directly from God, when you have those representations in the Bible, it doesn't necessarily mean that God is endorsing these ideas, but this is a historical document that is saying what has happened throughout history. But okay, let's not get sidetracked. I just wanted to point out that was the same Canaan that was from the curse. Verse 7, the descendants of Cush were Seba, Havilah, Sabeth, Raham, and Septica. The descendants of Ramah were Sheba and Dedan. Cush was also the ancestor of Nimrod. And just for fun, Nimrod, apparently it means rebellious one, because I looked that up. And it also makes me wonder, like, if he is the rebellious one, was he named before or after they knew he was rebellious? Like, was he a baby born and they named him Nimrod and said, that means rebellious one because you're going to be rebellious, as like a prophecy? Or did he start being rebellious and they were like, I got the perfect name for you. We're going to name you this. Like, what came first? Was the action, the person? Like, how do we know how to name these people? Okay. Verse 8, Cush was also the ancestor of Nimrod, who was the first historic warrior on earth. Interesting that he's the first historic warrior on earth. That makes me think of like when they talk about the great like warriors of old and how they could potentially have been Nephilim. Like, is Nimrod a descendant of the fallen angels that we talked about earlier in Genesis, where the fallen angels are mating, or the sons of God are mating with women, human women, and creating this offspring race? And if that's the case, does that mean that Nephilim survived the flood? Because we know that God sent the flood partially because of, obviously because of the wickedness, but also the sons of God were mating with women and creating this hybrid species, and God didn't like that. But does this mean they survived the flood? Is Goliath actually a descendant of the Nephilim line? So that means that they survived the flood, or are these just normal people who just happen to be like described as very heroic, or for Goliath as a giant? I have questions. Verse 9, since he was the greatest hunter in the world, his name became proverbial. People would say, this man is like Nimrod, the greatest hunter in the world. He built his kingdom. Okay, so he had a kingdom. Nimrod had a kingdom. Does that make him a king? Wait a minute. I wonder what they mean by kingdom. What do they mean by kingdom here? He built his kingdom in the land of Babylonia, with the cities of Babylon, Iraq, Akkad, and Calneh. From there, he expanded his territory to Assyria, building the cities of Nineveh, Rehoboth-ir, Calah, and Rezin, the great city located between Nineveh and Calah. I recognize Nineveh because Jonah had to go to Nineveh to deliver a message for God. I remember Nineveh very clearly. I find it interesting that Nimrod is building his kingdom. I need to know what that made him, because in my mind, we didn't have kings until after the judges' rule and all this stuff, and we had wasn't King Saul the first king? So does kingdom not necessarily mean that you're the ruler over that area? I have questions. I need to know. Lord, I need you to, I can't wait to ask you all of the questions. All right. Verse 13. Mizraim was the ancestor of the Ludites, Ammonites, Leabites, Nephites, Pathrusites, Calahites and Caphtorites, from whom the Philistines came. Oof, that's a lot of names. Verse 15, Canaan's oldest son was Sidon, the ancestor of the Sidonians. Canaan was also the ancestor of the Hittites, Jebusites, Amorites, Girgashites, Hivites, Arkites, Sinites, Arvadites, Zemarites, and Hamathites. Canaan, you had so many descendants. Wow. And a lot of those are names that I'm like recognizing from other parts in the Bible that I've read. So, okay, interesting. The Canaanite clans eventually spread out, and the territory of Canaan extended from Sidon in the north to Gerar and Gaza in the south, and east as far as Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, and Zeboim near Lasha. Okay, I recognize Sodom and Gomorrah. I'm sure a lot of you recognize those names. And interesting that, so obviously, okay, Canaan's descendants were the Canaanites among all these other ones. And the Canaanites were, I believe, that the land that God had given the Israelites, or the promised land that was going to be for the Israelites. The Canaanites had settled there first, and then the Israelites had to come and drive them out. So all very interesting that it was the Canaanites in particular, the ones who are named after this cursed son, who are the people who end up being driven out of Israel for the Israelites. Interesting. Verse 20. These were the descendants of Ham, identified by clan, language, territory, and national identity. Descendants of Shem, verse 21. Sons were also born to Shem, the older brother of Japheth. Hold on. Did you notice that when we talked about the descendants of Japheth and the descendants of Ham, they specifically called them descendants of these people. But now we get to verse 21, and it's calling out sons were born to Shem. It's specifying gender. So does that mean in the other verses that the people named were not necessarily all men? Were they not necessarily all sons? Why is there the distinction here that sons were also born to Shem, but they didn't call them sons for Ham and Japheth? Is that just this translation? I have questions. Okay. Shem was the ancestor of all the descendants of Eber. Verse 22. The descendants of Shem were Elam, Asher, Arphaxad, Lud, and Aram. The descendants of Aram were Uz, Hul, Gether, and Mash. Uz. I feel like that's a city name somewhere in the Bible. Is that right? Or maybe it's Ur. Oh, I can't remember. All right. Verse 24. Arphaxad was the father of Shelah, and Shelah was the father of Eber. Eber had two sons. The first was named Peleg, which means division. For during his lifetime, the people of the world were divided into different language groups. His brother's name was Joktan. Hold on. Again, what came first? So was Peleg born and they said, hey, we're going to name you division because something is going to happen and everybody's going to get divided during your lifetime? Or was he named something else and they changed his name because the Tower of Babel happened during his lifetime and they decided to name him division? How are people named? How are people named here? Or did they name him this name and it originally had no meaning, and then they decided that word means division? You know, I have questions. God, I have questions. Can't wait to ask you all the questions. Okay. Verse 26. Joktan was the ancestor of Almodad, Sheleph, Hazramaveth, Jira, Hodaran, Uzala, Dikla, Obal, Abimelech, Sheba, Ophir, Havilah, and Jobab. Ooh, a lot of names. Please forgive me if I said those all completely wrong. All these were descendants of Joktan. The territory they occupied extended from Mesha all the way to Sephar in the eastern mountains. These were the descendants of Shem, identified by clan, language, territory, and national identity. Conclusion, verse 32. These are the clans that descended from Noah's sons, arranged by nation according to their lines of descent. All the nations of the earth descended from these clans after the great flood. So all of us are descended from these clans. All of us are descended from these people, from Noah's line, which is always a good reminder to remember that we are all united as one. We were all created in God's image. We were all made to be like him and have communion with him. We're all equal people, okay? We're all descendants from the same place. It's just such a good reminder. And I find it interesting that it says here, and it made a good point in this chapter to say that each of these groups is identified by clan, language, territory, national identity. And the language piece, if we have the Tower of Babel coming up in Genesis 11, does that mean that... So did they have their own languages before? I'm assuming did they not have their own languages before, but we're kind of foreshadowing like this is building the foundation that eventually all of these groups, when they get separated, will have their own language. They didn't yet, but they will. And then that's how we all like break up and become different nationalities and different clans and, what have you. I don't know, all very interesting, but that is the end of chapter 10. A lot of names, a lot of pronunciation there. Thank you for bearing with me. I appreciate you. If you hung in there the whole time, please like, comment, subscribe, share the video, share the podcast, anything that you can do to please help out the channel. It's very appreciated. And I will see you next time. Bye.